Hi guys, okay, it's Frankie V from Frozen Sand with a long overdue episode of working with power tools, which is, as explained on many occasions, it's just a quickie behind the scenes look see of the going ons of our development of Resurgence, which is a port of the Urban Terror Classic from the id Tech 3 engine over to the Unreal 4 engine. And really just to keep our community of urban terrorist rebels up to date, and of course showing off some stuff and being aware that things are being worked on a constant basis. Each and every day, somebody is working on something, and, every once in a while, it's nice to be able to just kind of throw up some general information as to what's actually occurring in some sort of manner. So this is just me throwing on the microphone and chit-chatting about things that I find interesting, and not necessarily what you might find interesting. So in this case, I've been working on off and on different areas of the development of the game. It's probably, as far as content goes, not an area that I don't get my fingers involved in pushing stuff around to make it work. Kind of ideal, making assets available, and things are coming along pretty good. Ideally, it would be nice to be further ahead, but yes, there is a playable version of the game. Yes, you can shoot somebody and accumulate points and play capture the flag and in well, let's say a semi-raw state. So what we're working towards, of course, is a working alpha where things are a little bit more, let's say, polished as far as the end user being able to play on an active server, so we can test out the questions that need to be answered that can only be answered under, let's say, practical player loads. Everything seems to work fine, but of course, things can go bump in the night once you got more people involved, and they figure out ways to mess up a perfectly good um, example of how things should work. So, so at the moment, I've decided to start a new conversion project. In this case, convert Raiders from the id Tech 3 over to Unreal 4. Based on now we have better information of how to actually do that directly from the source, and since Raiders is part of the Frozen Sand franchise, so to speak, we have paperwork that says that we can do what we need to do as far as advancing this as an asset from one platform to the other, particularly that it was actually developed with the original the FS Tech 1 design engine in mind. So, but in this case, since we moved over to a new platform in the form of Unreal 4, there are obviously a complete change in techniques that would be a benefit as part of the learning curve that I have discovered. So, oh, excuse me. So I'll take this opportunity to kind of take a walk around and pass on some valuable tips that you could use in your own map design, be it for Urban Terror or if you want to make some maps for Unreal Tournament or even for your own projects that would be of value as to things that I've learned by as discovered through making mistakes, or how to make improvements to the overall result as being predictable. So that's the thing about map design or environment design in general, is a predictable result. So if you push a button, you throw some lights into it, and things don't behave in a predictable manner, that's not really a good thing, because you now go, well, that's kind of messed up, and then you got to take the time to kind of figure it out. So along the way, I figured out a few tricks to actually get the lighting behavior to behave the way I would want to, and expect it to. But let's start from the beginning. I've done, as you can see, I've done some landscaping work, and this has been my first opportunity to use a product that we have purchased through the marketplace called, I think it's called automatic landscaping materials or something like that. I can't remember. You can find it by just typing auto in material in the search box, and this is what will come up. Now this is pretty cool. This is actually a really cool product in that it's actually a procedural type of material. So if I select the landscape and look over to where do I have to look over here? Here we go. I can go to the material and bring it up, and as you can see, the landscaping material has been designed as an instant type of material, so changes can be made to various different types of elements that make up this as a material. The material itself, if we go over to our landscaping tool and we go over to paint, and you can see we have a pretty big a lot of different materials. Now the interesting thing is these are attached as a procedural type of occurrence as attached to a particular layer. So for example, slope is an indication of how this material that's been assigned to slope will be activated when the landscape tool is a little bit more sloped than it would be as say to something that is planar, or slope variation. It depends on how much information that you give it. So let's take, for example, we hit the sculpting tool and we hit the sculpt, and let's make that brush a bit bigger just to see what's going to happen. And we hit the surface. That's what happens, is now that this ground material, as you can see, is a combination of various different types of materials that have been applied to this surface automatically. So it's not a case of you have to you do your detailing work and do this and do that and the other thing, but right from the start you can get a very good result just based on the procedural application of the material to the surface, and it's very quick in how it can be added and variations made. You can have it automatically generates foliage. Now I must admit the foliage looks like it's highly caffeinated and it's twitching around, so I'll probably have to dig down deeper to figure out how to settle down the action. It's probably built into the material of how to control the actual animation of the foliage, I would have to assume, because this is not what I would consider a pleasant result. But so tubbing in is actually rather quick as far as what's going on outside of the map. So if I sort of zoom me up into the air, you can see that it's our little Raiders environment is surrounded by mountainscape. So it looks actually quite pleasant. I've had the third person template added in an original version that I was working on. Which I'll get into as an explanation as to my workflow as to at least doing the conversions, not necessarily creating a unique environment or a map from scratch. Conversions are actually pretty easy because the important thing is, of course, is the layout, how the flow of the map and what have you. So, as a map maker, yeah, I'm kind of cheating. But it's still a lot of work involved, particularly as to the need to create a compatible version of a semi-popular map. Raiders is actually a very popular map in Knockout. I would say mostly because of a lot of green is involved, and that of course means that that players will figure it out sooner than later that night vision goggles is a must type of loadout requirement. So, anyways, that's a quick explanation of a purchasable asset that I would recommend, and kind of play around with it if you need this kind of thing, because, well, basically the tubbing in to replace this little zone. If you're familiar with with Raiders, you know that if you run into this area here, it's what used to be like a very shallow or very narrow forested area, but now you can come out here and you're blasted into the outside world. And of course I'm going to have to put a fake wall across here. People will learn pretty quick that you can't go past in here, and maybe bring it out a little bit further so somebody can splash around in the lake area here. Maybe a little bit further. I don't know just yet, because I haven't got that far. But this would be an interesting area for things like knife fights and close quarter combat. Somebody gets out into this, tries to hide behind a tree. There's some natural let's say a natural interest in this, in making this area a little bit more involved with as part of the map overall. Okay, moving on and moving forward. Now we're going to talk about I'm going to talk a little bit about my workflow and a few tips and tricks of how to establish an environment, a map, using a technique that I use that's usually referred in applications like 3ds Max or even Maya as it being called edit in place, meaning that wherever the object is within 3D space is how it's going to be positioned within relative space inside of Unreal 4 as a one-to-one match, as long, of course, the application that you're using is set up to use the real-world scaling values that are present in Unreal 4. Since Unreal 4 uses 1 centimeter equals, or 1 UE4 unit equals 1 centimeter, that's a real world value, which means that anything that you create in an application that's set up to work using a centimeter scale is going to be a perfect match to how it's imported into Unreal 4 as being edited in place. So that basically means that things that need to be interlocked will be interlocked in one application and the other, maintaining the fidelity of asset pathway that is rather important in this case. So where this stuff originated, of course, is in my application of choice, which is the 3ds Max. So here's what I have set up so far. I've set things up broken down into blocks, so it becomes a little bit more, let's say, manageable. And as to build assets, which doesn't look anything like what it is in Unreal 4, containing things like collision meshes and what have you as part of the development pipeline. Here's the construction of that back end part, and I just simply call this block 1, which defines an area that's being occupied by an asset. So so there's no specific naming of this object, but we do know that if this is selected, it's block 1 back wall, which is part of this editing layer. Interesting enough, Unreal 4 finally does support layering, so you can build things in layering, but you can also do things using level streaming to be able to introduce the A block as a streamable asset. And the benefit to that is you can have somebody else working on this asset as a standalone environment as a persistent to that file, and then include that in the within your main master project. But let's just unhide everything here so we can see what the heck is going on. So we'll go yes, and everything will just kind of hopefully not crash on us, because all of a sudden, boom, we got a boatload of different content. So You can see that it's not the most attractive looking setup as far as edit goes in place, but that's because the necessary build elements are is all what we're really after as being relative to the position within Unreal 4. So this is this is a back wall and that arch, and you might recognize these different elements. Um, I have some elements set up with UCX collision mesh, and let's hide this. But let's hide that. It's in there somewhere. Okay, there we go. This is actually the facade that is replacing the old asset that's underneath it. Let's see if I go isolate this. See, this is how it was extracted basically from the BSP file as to containing UV mapping information as well as the materials that have been applied to it. But of course, the construct is not really a benefit to Unreal 4, and I've gone ahead and did some cleanup onto it, but it's not an ideal asset as to in-place editing. Once we get back over to Unreal 4, I'll do a little bit of explaining. But the thing of interest here is that the construct of the facade as being gray boxed, I guess is a term we can use here, is acquiring an asset that is enclosed all the way around. And if I go select boundaries here, is this what kind of selection is this? Okay, normally if I was to select this and there was any gaps in the mesh and there was openings or open edged or not welded, this would show it off. Let's see if I can just do a quick creation here. We'll create a plane to see what would happen. Now, if there's any gaps or openings in my geometry, if I selected this, convert to poly as a tip, if you're using 3ds Max, you can use the select by border tool, and if you select this edge here, it'll select the entire border. So any gaps in the geometry or mesh that's not properly welded together, that creates a gap, can be quickly determined and fixed, so that if we select our runes facade, select our border tool, do a Control A, if we see any red highlighting on it, then that indicates that we have a gap or an unwelded edge in our facade. Now this is an important factor, because as you can see, I have two types of materials actually applied to this, that then creates a material link in Unreal 4 as to visibility. Now let's go back over to Unreal 4 so we can continue on with some tips and tricks and what have you. Now here's that facade we were just looking at, and if I go over and where is it, visibility, show only selected, then you can see that there is no back face issues as being a solid object in space. Now this becomes rather important when we start talking about lighting solutions, because Unreal 4 uses a real-world lighting model similar to what's being used in applications like 3ds Max or Maya or even Blender, where the procedural type of lighting solution, you can think of it more as like filling the world with a tub full of water, and if your object even has a slight crack into it, the water is going to find its way into the environment, creating a leak. Now, this is in itself not rather problematic, except for the fact that it creates some really unusual lighting artifacts in your environment. The slightest opening might as well be a 12-foot hole in your wall, as far as allowing lighting solutions to interact with the interior, which you don't want, right? Okay, so let's kind of Control H out of this. But what we want to do, of course, is focus on the environment in a way that when we start texturing it, we're only applying texturing elements to, okay, we got some unusual lighting problems here, which is probably a smoothing group problem, which, you know, another tips and tricks video is it means upcoming. Same thing here. That's usually a smoothing group issue. But if we look over here, this is actually pretty, you know, these other walls are actually very well lit. A bit of a lighting solution problem here. So this is what this type of facade creation allows you to quickly do, is figure out where the errors are and the problems are in as far as surface rendering goes. So ultimately, we want to get rid of all these little glitches and get rid of these artifacts that are popping up, which, you know, once you start throwing materials onto this thing here, they actually start to hide the issues in a way that you look at it and you say, I know I got a problem here, but I don't know what it is. So by creating a facade, the facade to begin with, you can go in and you can start seeing how the lighting is actually interacting with the surface areas. So if we look into this area, we can see quite easily that our ambient occlusion default out of the box is actually working in an expected manner. We look over here, we got some unusual lighting problems here, which could and should be corrected. I pretty well know that there's an interaction going on between the outside, this area here being interlocked and connected to this area here, which is creating a different color variation in the wall here. So this is actually this area over here, and this is this area over here. So that needs to be corrected. Not the best solution in the world, as I've discovered. But what there is also another uniqueness here, as I demonstrated in 3ds Max, in that the facade work is enclosed. That there is no open gaps or seams that will allow outside light to leak into this world, and so this interior is basically an absolutely lit by the direct light and the skylight, and setting up a rather exaggerated indirect lighting solution where, you know, the light just sort of comes into this area from the outside and bounces around from you know, open areas like the skylighting area here that allows lighting into this space, and then it bounces around. The bouncing has gotten better too, by the way. We're up to 4.19. And the rendering ability of Unreal 4 just improves, and it continues to improve. And from what I understand, in 4.20, we're going to have ray tracing available, which is going to be interesting, because a serious rendering engine cannot be a serious rendering engine without ray tracing. So that means, of course, that we're going to get better transparency solutions and color bleed and all sorts of wonderful things that can be done and can only be done in an engine like Unreal 4, in 3ds Max or Maya or Blender. You know, we don't want to leave anybody out, even the freebie guys. Okay, so a good example, though, of artifacts that can be created if you have a leaky facade is, here's a perfect example of, as I mentioned, there's obviously some sort of slight crack going on here where outside lighting is getting into this area, and that is because, let's hide that, and we'll hide that, and as you can see, there's no back face to this that prevents the outside light from bleeding into the environment. Keep in mind, of course, that if because this uses a real-world lighting model, if there's no back facing, then there's nothing to stop the light from coming in to this section here. So if we create the facade to start with as being edited in place, then we can work the lighting from the standpoint of getting it to look a little bit more natural from the start. Keep control over any kind of artifact control. If you apply a material to this, then the material should obviously look the way it's supposed to, and not all of a sudden having weird streaks blowing in, because we're only having a very plain material that is applied to the surface. Means that we can quickly determine if it's a problem with the material, or if it's a problem with smoothing groups, or if it's a problem that's being caused by a slight crack in the facade work. Which, as I mentioned, the area here, for example, is completely sealed off to the outside, and of course the exterior seals in the inside from the outside, so we're not getting any lighting bleed into that section of environment. So the lighting solution behaves entirely different than if you had built this using component parts to create the same result. And as we can see, a very predictable lighting solution. It comes out exactly the way you would expect it to do in this type of configuration. See, once again, here we have a little bit of artifacting going on, probably caused by, it could be a couple of different things. It could be that there's not enough UV space for the light map, or it could be a smoothing group issue, which is a unique feature to 3ds Max. Maya does not have smoothing groups. It's a 3ds Max thing. So having the incorrect smoothing solution to this, of course, can make unusual results turn up in this type of artifacting. We obviously, if we look around, we can get rid of that. It's probably, my guess, probably a UV mapping issue with the light map. Okay, so moving on and moving forward, I think we kind of illustrated. Oh, let's take a look at the difference of what the surface would look like once a material, PBR material, is actually applied. So this is actually a really nice texture. The normal mapping is a little bit exaggerated. It's using a parallax type of solution to the surface, which is a little bit, it needs to be toned down a bit. But what is interesting is how the corners turn out once it's welded, and then it's UV mapped, and it's you create your light map channel all connected and nicely laid out. If we look at the corner there, it seems to have a much more natural easement from one edge to the other as a 90-degree angle. Now, if we moved close to the wall, we can get a kind of better view of how this edging seems to smooth itself out as a single edge without having to chamfer the edging. It also takes in the ambient occlusion a little bit more nicer, because it's solving the entire room here as a single object rather than a series of component objects as being butted into one another. And of course you can see that there's no lighting artifacts that are bleeding in, or wayward lighting problems that everybody's always going, well, I got this really weird lighting coming into my environment. I don't know where it's coming from. And it's usually a micro crack. Now, long-term mappers and Radiant knows that the effect of that was normally what's called sparklies, where the edge is not quite connected together across the angle. So if you kind of look at it, what it tends to do is sparkle. So if you move back and forth, you go, oh, okay, well, I got a bit of a gap. Once again, we're dealing with a real world lighting model. So a slight micro split in the seam might as well be a 12-foot hole. Okay, as far as artifacts goes. Back facing too as well is important because it prevents our sunlight from just blasting through the wall and then lighting this up this area up here in an unnatural way. There's also another side benefit to back facing too as well, in that I usually color the back face in a different color. So the reason behind that, as another quick tip, is that anything area that is black is not visible to the player at any given angle. So if you're kind of walking through your environment here and all of a sudden you see a black edge, you know you're actually probably looking at part of the back facing on the exterior, and then you would have to change that color so you would recognize in your app of choice, being 3ds Max, Maya, or Blender, that you would have to texture map that, because it becomes visible to the player as they're kind of walking around, because, well, you spotted it in the first place. So I'm just kind of roaming around trying to see if I can spot any kind of splits or any kind of black that shows up. So I guess that kind of brings us up to date as to some worthwhile tricks and tips that I make use of as far as editing in place out of an application. In my case, I prefer using 3ds Max for any kind of building, and it's a quick way of being able to establish your scaling values as opposed to making use of component mapping. Now, that's not to say that you should abandon that, because the reality of the situation here is, of course, that we want to add more. You would want to add more and more and more detail, and besides looking at something that looks like it came out of Minecraft, you would want to add some surface detailing. See, I got some detailing bling, also referred as deco, as part of the skylights, but these are just overlays, floaters that can be added on, and using the facade to assist in establishing the relative scaling of the map relative to the player. That is always, I found, rather problematic when you're starting to build things using components, because you don't really have the initial relative scaling of the entire environment as a whole. So if you start out in one area by building something really cool looking out of components, to cut down, of course, on the amount of geometry overhead, in an effort thinking, we're going to make an efficient map, you're going to find that as it start moving outwards, everything as to scaling is going to be relative to the first object that you make. So in this case, lucky, we're converting a BSP to a full-out environment anyway, so we'd have the relative scaling established in the first place. But by building stuff as a facade in a 3D application, it allows you to establish your relative scaling of the total environment before you start putting on the bling bling. So as I demonstrated with the skylighting here, stuff could just be simply surfaced, skinned to the surface as far as component goes, or we can just texture the wall surface as part of the facade. Now, there's benefits of doing it that way too as well. First of all, facades are very, 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 very low impact as far as geometry goes. The amount of geometry we're being used is probably less than, as a total, is probably less than one highly detailed component part that we would paste over top of the surface. Second is that we solve our any kind of bleed problem using a back surface that prevents light from getting in, as well as maintaining light surface tension within this space, that if we just hang another wall up against another wall, then we don't have to worry about all of a sudden getting what we refer to as sparklies in Radiant, of course. No, Unreal 4 does not sparkle. But another benefit to this as well is we can use this as our per surface collision, if we wish, because the geometry is actually equal to or less than it would be if we used the UCX collision surface, or even the amount of surface area that's taken up by using blocking volumes. So, ta-da! I guess that's enough information of value of worth at this point. So, if you have any questions, by all means, post it in the comment section. I'll throw it on. I'll try to remember to maybe apply it to a future episode of working with power tools. Is there something, it makes it easier for me too as well. If people tell me what they're interested in seeing, I don't have to make stuff up. Keeping the course this episode PG rated. I'm just kind of scooting around to see if there's anything that was obvious that I missed. Oh, also the new fog system, this is so cool because this is now a volumetric, and which means that we can have fog outside but not have the fog inside. So if we're inside here, we got no fog, but if we go outside, we have fog. So it's a volumetric in that we can create different areas of interest using fog as a focal point. Now, I always liked using fog in 4.3, 4.2, or IDTech 3 because it really defocused the area as being dirty. Because if we remove the fog, there's nothing in the volume between the player and what the player is seeing, so it tends to look rather unnatural, where in nature air is actually dirty. It contains particles, effects, and what have you, which diffuses the lighting in a much more natural way. But if we take our fog here and remove it, well, ta-da, you can see what happens. Everything just gets blown out of proportion. So with the fog in place, we can play with the scatter, the density. Also, it has a nice effect creating God rays if you want that. You turn on shafts and it gives you a much more natural looking God rays effect coming through the foliage. The only thing that I haven't figured out quite yet, maybe somebody could put it in the comments, is how to do a volumetric. Because I want to be able to have God rays coming down into this area here, but it would probably require this area to have some form of fog element to dirty the air so the light has something to reflect off of. If I put in a spotlight into an open area like this, the volumetric of that light actually shows up really nicely. But as soon as you go inside, of course, if you have the volumetric turned out for outside use, then I'll probably have to make a fog mask. Which you can do is you can control the volume of the fog in a given area using some kind of a mask, which I haven't gotten into yet. Future episode will show how to, but there are tutorials out there that explains how that's done. So I think that kind of we kind of had a really nice walk around of the conversion of Raiders over to Unreal 4 as a project in progress, and covered a few I hope some worthwhile tips to pass on, and hopefully you can make use of them in your own project. This is actually I really like the results that I'm getting with this type of technique than I did when working on Turnpike, which is kind of horrific considering all the small little micro issues that are going on there. Little artifacts that are really kind of messes up the illusion. It's kind of like having I don't know. It's kind of like having a toy that has breakage on it or whatever. It just has a kind of sense of lack of quality to the overall the finished results, the fit and finish of the finish of the product, I guess we could say. Anyways, I hope that this will satisfy you for a little while. I'm kind of waiting for some files to be updated and what have you. So hopefully they're done by now. So I figured, kill two birds with one stone, I guess. Okay, anyway, see you in the next one, guys. Bye-bye.